And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Livesey. She is a professor, an associate professor of religious studies in the College of Professional Continuing Studies. She's been at OU since 2008. She has a BA in comparative literature from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, an MTS from the Phillips Theological Seminary, and a PhD in religious studies from Southern Methodist University. She has a very impressive publication record. She's published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and in addition to that, 2 books that look fascinating: Circumcision as a Malleable Symbol, that was published in 2010, and Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis, Demosthenes, Cicero, Paul, and that was published in 2016. She's also spoken at numerous conferences, and one of the things that I found very interesting about her CD is that she's spoken both in many academic forums, but also in very public forums as well, which is so wonderful when we think about bringing the humanities to the wider public as well. In addition to all of her papers, she's also given 2 Just Lunch talks in the past. In 2011, she spoke about she gave a talk on Old Paul and New Paul, recent recent Pauline scholarship, and in 2013, Excavating Israel's Past, Findings from Hukok. So that's just a brief introduction to our speaker today, and I'm glad that everyone is here, and I really welcome Professor Livesey and look forward to her talk.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. A special thanks to Alan Levinson for inviting me. And one of my colleagues is here from my college, Steve, so I appreciate that as well. Paul is usually not a very popular person among the Jewish group, and I've worked at trying to get at the roots of anti-Semitism through my investigations of Paul. So a lot of what I do has that as its source and objective. And it may not be as apparent here, but I think you'll see what I mean as I get started. So please follow along. There's a handout. I was going to have an overhead, but Trice kindly advised me against that, and I'm grateful for that. So follow along on the handout. It has a flip side as well. This is a critical passage in Paul. It comes from his letter to the Galatians, and this is the passage that I will be reviewing today. So I'm going to start by reading this, the front of your sheet. It's Galatians 1:10-20. For am I now persuading humans or God? Am I seeking to please humans? If I were still pleasing humans, I would not be the anointed slave. For I am making known to you, brothers, that the good news proclaimed by me is not according to a human. For I did not receive it from a human, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus the Anointed. For you heard of my former behavior in Judaism, that I persecuted to the superlative degree the assembly of God and tried to destroy it, and how I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my people of the same age. I was extremely zealous for the traditions of the ancestors. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, so that I might proclaim him among the non-Jews, immediately I did not consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go into Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I did go up into Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In these things I write to you before God, I do not lie. This passage is traditionally read as Paul's heartfelt and genuine remarks concerning his own personal religious experience. Indeed, the passage in many ways lends itself to such an interpretation. It is autobiographical and thus by genre alone seemingly trustworthy. Paul too seemingly becomes confessional, admitting to his harsh treatment of communities who recognize Jesus. And Paul provides information about his whereabouts and even claims not to lie. What's there not to believe? For Pauline scholars, the trustworthiness of this passage is of critical importance, for it is routinely mined for its facts about Paul himself, his itinerary, and even his religious status. After his revelation and obedience to God's call, Paul claims to travel first to Arabia, then to Damascus, and only after 3 years to Jerusalem. These temporal and spatial indicators are among the primary building blocks by which scholars formulate Pauline chronologies, and which in turn serve to situate Paul in the 1st century CE, Paul an important apostle. Christian theology follows on the seeming trustworthiness and historical reliability of the passage. For here, Paul claims to be God's recipient of the good news, or the gospel. God's gesture towards Paul is taken as his authorization to proclaim the message and authorization of the message itself. And when Paul self-proclaims or self-describes as an outstanding Jew, exceeding his peers in Jewish training, yet open to receiving God's call to be an apostle of Jesus to the Gentiles, Paul becomes a model of faithful conversion from Judaism to Christianity. Christian supersessionism can be said to begin here. Christian superiority over Judaism is evoked, and thus Christian doctrine is often resistant to readings other than a heartfelt and honest one. Yet is a face value and trusting reading of this passage sustainable? For this, I mean, is it consistent with ancient compositional practices? In what follows, I argue that it is not, and that while Christian history and doctrine continue to exert considerable force to maintain a face value and trusting reading of the passage, recent advances in literary and rhetorical studies make such a reading no longer sustainable. Indeed, when decades ago some New Testament scholars assessed that Paul is inconsistent in what he relates about himself, face value readings themselves began to break down. Other important scholarship on the overall status of Paul's letters, on rhetoric in the New Testament, on the limits and goals of ancient autobiography, significantly challenge the understanding that Paul here and elsewhere can be taken at face value. Before providing a rhetorical analysis of Galatians 1:10-20, I provide a brief sketch of earlier scholarship on which the face value interpretation relies, review pertinent scholarship that succeeds and challenges that earlier scholarship, and conclude with remarks on why rhetorical analysis matters. The early 20th century German theologian Adolf Deismann has had a broad and long-lasting influence on the modern question of the status of Paul's letters. According to him, Paul's New Testament letters compared favorably with the then newly discovered papyri found in the rubbish mounds of ancient cities and market towns in Egypt. These papyri consisted of legal documents such as leases, bills and receipts, bills of divorce, tax lists, but also letters and notes and school exercises. Despite the contrast in document type and content, Deismann argued that the everyday quality and naturalness of the writing style found in the Egyptian papyri letters well reflected the genuineness and authenticity of Paul's New Testament letters. His assessment of the Pauline letters also extended to an evaluation of Paul's social location. Like Jesus, Paul was a lower or middle class tent maker, and he addressed himself to the lower classes. Deismann's analysis of the ancient Egyptian papyri also led him to formulate a distinction between non-literary letters and creative epistles. According to Deisman, a letter is private and straightforward, a means of communication between persons who are separated from each other. A letter is natural, confidential, and personal, and essentially no different from an oral conversation, though only one half of it. By contrast, an epistle is conventional, a literary form, artistic, and ultimately destined for a wider public. Epistles are species of literature and have nothing in common with letters apart from their external form. Again, according to Deisman, all of Paul's New Testament letters or compositions were letters. He remarks, Paul's letters were real. Each one is a piece of life. Deisman's comments reveal the implications of his view. The non-literary characteristics as letters are a guarantee of Paul's letters' reliability. Their positive documentary value for the history of the apostolic period of our religion, particularly the history of St. Paul himself and his great vision. In developing his view, Deisman was countering an even earlier understanding of Paul's compositions, which compared them favorably to classical literature, to works such as those of Plato and Demosthenes. These earlier scholars assessed that such a comparison lent a sense of respect and dignity to the letters and to the religion it represented. For Deisman, however, Christianity began in a primitive and pristine state, he called it Ur-Christendom, as a lower class movement, and it was fundamentally in opposition to high culture. That the earlier comparison to Paul's letters to the elite and highly educated class did not conform to Deisman's understanding of Christian origins is confirmed by his remark that Paul's greatness lay precisely in the spontaneity of his religion, apart from system. While Deisman's perspective continues to influence the general understanding of the status of Paul's compositions as genuine letters, his views regarding authorship and ancient epistolography are no longer deemed reliable and accurate by modern standards of analysis. His rigid antithesis between personal, natural, spontaneous, with no artistry on the one hand, and conventional, literary on the other, is inaccurate by the standards of modern behavioral science and literary theory. These modern theorists hold all intelligible human behaviors having some conventional aspect to it. Moreover, his distinction between private and public epistles does not accurately reflect ancient Greco-Roman society and its practices, which used friendship and family models to theorize about public functions such as politics. Such a distinction is more a product of modern than ancient society. Finally, his distinction between public and private letters collapses when one considers that some ancient authors of so-called private and friendly letters, like those of Cicero, composed letters with an eye toward later publication. The notion that Paul's letters were spontaneous outpourings and similar to one-sided oral conversations is further undermined when one considers that ancient letter writing, and indeed all ancient writing, were anything but spontaneous exercises. Ancient compositions required forethought, both in terms of their content and execution. Authors needed supplies, such as paper, papyrus, or parchment sheets. Ink had to be prepared in advance. Authors also required access to a scribe, as Paul's own letters evince. As we now know, only a small fraction of the population could engage in this type of activity. More importantly, authorship required knowledge, education in the compositional process. Although Paul's level of education cannot be known with absolute certainty, his letters provide abundant evidence of training through the secondary level of education at the least, with likely additional instruction in ancient rhetoric. That Paul composed letters also speaks to his social location, in contrast to Deisman's assessment of Paul as a lower class tradesman, a tent maker. He's better understood as having been a member of what was likely a relatively small group of literates, those who had the means and access to author compositions. New Testament scholar Paul Robertson remarks, "Very few in the ancient Mediterranean had sufficient means and education to compose a text of the sophistication and length that we find in something like Paul's letters. And this narrow group of people and their literary compositions interacted directly or indirectly through loose literary networks comprising such activities as dinner parties, literary salons, correspondences, book selling, public orations, and literary patronage." Many post-Deisman Pauline scholars, indeed entirely too many to name, interpret Paul's letters rhetorically. Among the studies that prove to be the most convincing are those that focus on Paul's use of rhetorical tropes, figures, and techniques, rather than those that evaluate his letters as a whole, according to one of the Greco-Roman rhetorical categories. Influential and noteworthy scholarship are the studies by Stanley K. Stowers on Paul's use of prosopoieia, which is speech and character, and his earlier study on Paul's use of diatribe. Mark Nanos's work on Paul's use of ironic rebuke in Galatians, and Antoinette Wyer's analysis of Paul's arguments in 1 Corinthians. The latter two studies fall into the category of social rhetorical theory. This combined scholarship, along with countless more, indicates beyond a doubt that Paul knew of and employed the art and tools of rhetoric. Discussions of rhetoric likely began with Plato, although critical of rhetoric because it did not deal with truth or reality. It was Plato in his Gorgias in which we encounter the term rhetoric. There, Plato defined the rhetor as pathos demiurgos, a worker of persuasion. Later, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the ability in each particular case to see the available means of persuasion. Aristotle also determined that rhetoric was the correlative of dialectic. As the modern scholar of rhetoric George Kennedy explains, dialectic dealt with general questions and was usually in dialogue form, while rhetoric dealt with particular issues and was generally in the form of continuous prose. The realm of dialectic is common opinions, and common opinions make no claims on absolute truth. While ancient theorists offered various definitions of rhetoric, with some stressing the goal of persuasion and others the notion of speaking well, rhetoric from ancient to modern times is generally considered as a system of effective and artistic communication, whether in speech or writing, originally concerned with public address in civic and religious life, but then adapted to literary composition. It held a role in education from the 4th century BCE until the early modern period. While the 19th century saw a decline in the teaching of classical rhetoric, the 20th century exhibits a revitalization of it. Following on the theory that rhetoric pertained to dialectic or common opinions, the modern theorists Chaim Perlman and Lucy Albrecht-Tutecha, while they called it new rhetoric, returned rhetoric to its ancient understanding. For these modern theorists, rhetoric pertained to everyday discourse. It was simply argumentation. Their analysis, along with the work of other modern theorists, allowed rhetoric to return to its place as an aspect in a wide range of discourse, including literary and religious compositions. Burton Mack, another New Testament modern scholar, comments, "Rhetoric is to society and its discourse what grammar is to culture and its language." This same impulse can be seen in the remarks of Todd Penner and Davina Lopez, who, with regard to Paul's letters, comment, "There is no place outside of rhetoric in Paul's letters. Every word links with other words, forming series of statements that play a role in making arguments that Paul presumably finds important to share with his recipients." Furthermore, ancient rhetorical theory and its modern incarnations, as seen especially in the new rhetoric, understands that argumentation is not a conveyor of pre-existing truth. Instead, truth is worked out in language, in discourse. Rhetoric is the vehicle by which persons actively participate in the creation of truths. In this regard, New Testament scholar Wilhelm Wöllner remarks, the rhetorical view of religious literature takes us beyond viewing language as a reflection of reality, even ultimate reality, as understood in terms of traditional metaphysical and idealist philosophy, and takes us to the social aspect of language, which is an instrument of communication and influence on others. As one might imagine, this expansive understanding of rhetoric, along with the notion that rhetoric is not a conveyor of pre-existing truths, has not been universally embraced by New Testament scholars. For instance, the prominent Pauline scholar J. Lewis Martin remarks, rhetoric can serve the gospel, but the gospel itself is not fundamentally a matter of rhetorical persuasion. What Martin implies by this is that the gospel, whatever he may mean by that, is of first order importance. It is, according to him, not only Paul's starting point, but also truth itself. In this view, Paul is simply a conveyor or a mouthpiece of truth. Galatians 1:10-20 can be understood as rhetorical autobiography. It has similarities to the ancient category of persuasion by ethos, classified by Aristotle as the most powerful among three primary means of persuasion. Persuasion by ethos requires orators or authors to elicit audience confidence. While the moral worthiness of the author is important in this type of argumentation, it's nonetheless secondary to the goal of persuasion itself. Indeed, the ultimate goal, that of gaining audience trust, and thus this gaining audience trust allowed authors to magnify their own trustworthiness, to self-aggrandize when and where necessary in order to persuade. Because persuasion was the ultimate goal, authors who adopted autobiographical rhetoric often dissembled. George Lyons aptly states, the major interest of most ancient biographers and autobiographers was not historical reality, but human potentiality and idealization. Again, for ancient biographers and autobiographers, truth was secondary to the author's primary goal of persuasion. Authors adopted certain set topoi to advance their goal. Among these are the treatment of an author's ancestry, a discussion of their upbringing, education, and profession, a presentation of their actions to illustrate moral character and purpose, and a self-comparison to other exemplary persons, often for the purpose of imitation. As we will see, several of these topoi are present in Galatians 1:10-20. Ancient autobiography can also be compared to the rhetorical figure prosopoieia, speech and character, a Greek word whose root prosopon means face. Prosopoieia entails the invention of a character, or the attribution of speech and personality to a character. Otherwise put, it's a creation of a fictional person. It's recognized that Paul employs speech and character in his extant writings, and I can give you some citations. Turning now to rhetorical analysis of Galatians 1:10-20, we can see that Paul is a savvy strategist and not a spontaneous speaker. Typical of ancient autobiographers, Paul is highly selective with regard to what he divulges about himself, thereby maintaining full control of his discourse. According to the rhetorical situation he establishes, rival religious authorities are leading the Galatians astray. Thus, to regain their allegiance, Paul self-characterizes as far worthier than these others. Using a divine-human contrasting motif as an organizing principle, along with a host of other rhetorical techniques, Paul's self fashions loftily and creatively. Neither the good news to which he refers, 1:11, nor his revelation, nor the incidents pertaining to his former life in Judaism are themselves endpoints, essential in and of themselves, but instead serve supporting roles in the service of his larger, authority-establishing purpose. That the details are less significant is in part confirmed by the fact that Paul himself relates different particulars surrounding a similar event elsewhere. So at this point, please follow along. You might flip the paper over. It's the same, but I've got it highlighted with verse numbers. In the constructed divine-human dichotomy, Paul self-locates in a hierarchically superior position to that of his opponents, on the side of God. The words Paul speaks are not his own, but instead God's, 1:11. God supplies the content of the good news Paul proclaims, 1:12b, and God charged him to proclaim it, 1:15b. Paul claims to be a slave or a servant, doulos, of the risen anointed one, Christos, 1:10c. Moreover, God is the active agent in his life even before his birth, 1:15a. The passage begins with rhetorical questions. A rhetorical question functions to put the receiver or hearer on the defensive, as it assumes the correct answer is known but somehow forgotten or ignored. The receiver-hearer is thus presumed to be lacking in some common knowledge. At the same time, with his questions, Paul admonishes his hearers for assuming that he is in the business of persuasion and that he is persuading God. Whether or not his hearers assume these things is not at issue. It is the rhetorical questions themselves that function to place Paul authoritatively above his audience. The first part of the question is hyperbolic and self-contradictory. Paul claims to be out of the business of persuasion altogether, that his words somehow supersede rhetoric, while he simultaneously participates in the use of a rhetorical trope. With his second rhetorical question, 1:10b, Paul engages in a common form of ancient polemics, the denial of being a people pleaser. To emphasize this point, he repeats the Greek verb that denotes to please in successive phrases. Areskain in 1:10b, eriskon, 1:10c, which are instances of polyptoton, which that is the repetition of the same root under a different form. At the end of this passage, Paul employs another trope common in ancient polemics, namely claiming to tell the truth. That's found throughout ancient writers. Antitheses, verbal constructions formulated in the negative, are also evident in Galatians 1:11-12. Antithesis is a form of amplification which involves pleonasm, the use of more words than are necessary, correction, and the balancing of negative and positive clauses. Antithesis serves to strengthen and clarify the author's claims. With antithesis, Paul contrasts his past life, construed as his human-driven self, with his positively construed present life as an agent of God, 15-16. Indeed, he magnifies the contrast between his former and current selves. Formerly, Paul persecuted Jesus' followers, the Assembly of God, 1:13b. Accentuating those negative actions, he argues that he strongly persecuted Jesus' followers, even attempting to destroy them, 1:13b. The verb uperthun is an imperfect implying continual past action, which means to destroy, ravage, waste, or plunder. Moreover, the Greek uperbolen means exceedingly or to the superlative degree in 1:13b. As a standalone adverb, huper denotes overmuch, above, just as today the English word hyper, a transliteration of the Greek, means excessive. While in the second instance, huper, 114b, is a preposition, through the repetition of the same syllables and sounds, Paul brings about a return reference to huperbolin, to its most negative association. Why paint his past action in such strongly negative terms when he has full control, when he could just as easily have self-characterized more favorably? No one asked these questions. Next, when Paul discusses his early education, 114 A and B, he also self-portrays at the extreme as someone not just interested in the traditions of the fathers, but very zealous. Taken together, his purported zeal for his ancestral traditions and his strong persecution of Jesus' followers are mutually reinforcing details and serve to create a particular characterization of his past as a fiery zealot. The passage takes a turn in a new direction, however, at Galatians 1:15. The but when, hoti dei, marked in bold, is how Paul signals his transition from a human to divine-driven agent. There he shifts his persona from a fiery zealot human self to the slave of God. The adversative conjunction but, dei, indicates a changed situation, while the adverb when, hote, denotes a change in time. On the situational plane, Paul credits God as the responsible agent of his new and changed life. On the temporal plane, he relegates his excessive and damaging actions to his past life. In the remaining verses of the unit, Paul continues to self-present as someone who now operates under divine direction, 1:16 to 17. He twice notes that he does not consult with others, but instead goes alone to Arabia and Damascus. By implication, Paul is untarnished by the influence of others and thus remains solely under the guidance of God. In sum, this autobiographical passage in Galatians suggests the work of an author fully at home in ancient composition and rhetoric, challenging in turn the view that Paul was a spontaneous writer who faithfully advanced his vision. As an ancient author, Paul would not have been interested in relaying facts or the truth about himself, but instead in persuading hearers using the best compositional and rhetorical tools known to him. As the letter's composer, Paul controlled its contents and style. Through various rhetorical techniques, he self-fashioned as superior to others. In contrast to readings that are fact-seeking, this analysis understands Paul's revelation, his travels, his former life as a superlative Jew with skepticism. I'm still going, I just need to make sure. Conclusions are coming. In conclusion, the view that Paul wrote honestly, openly, and spontaneously is based on a hermeneutic of faith, in which trust finds trustworthiness. Such a view, however, does not comport well or even at all with ancient composers and their compositions. Rhetoric informed and played an enormously large role in the development of ancient compositions, with ancient autobiography forming one important means of written expression. Ancient authors did not concern themselves with facts, but instead with persuasion. For them, truth and facts were contingent upon their argumentative goals. Their compositions dealt with the realm of the probable. This evidence suggests that with Paul we're dealing with an ancient, educated, and savvy author, and not an in-the-moment confessional writer. This analysis unsettles the ground supporting the historical Paul, both with regard to his activities and his revelation. It confounds the innocence inherent in Christian origin theories like those of Adolf Deisman, theories that continue to reside in the Christian imagination. human agency and events of various sorts, social, political, even environmental, account for these origins, not the miraculous. Christianity began not with small groups of people looking up to heaven, asking where Christ had gone and when he would return, as the book of Acts would have it, but instead among literate groups, among ancient religious thinkers who indulged in creative speculations. To speculate through argumentation is different from narrating facts. The former allows for debate, the essence of rhetoric. The latter leads to notions of certainty, and in the worst instances, in the wrong hands, force and violence. As the long and highly disturbing history of anti-Judaism attests, fact-seeking face value readings cause harm. Educated analyses, coupled with our best moral instincts, are preferred options to advance human understanding.